Alright, good morning everybody. This is the last video lecture of the school year. This is chapter 22 of the Brief American Pageant. In this chapter we talk about Reconstruction. This is the chapter that we reference quite a bit when we start 1302 and start talking about chapter 23 with the beginning of the Gilded Age. And this is it's kind of like that middle portion between the great big Civil War and the culmination of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, 100 years later. It's quite a bit of stuff that was done wrong and not a whole lot of stuff that was done right. So let's go ahead and start cutting it up. Okay, chapter 22, the Ordeal of Reconstruction. I actually got it wrong in the last chapter. There are 4 chapters in the book that have a President Lincoln quote. This one is from his second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So with the battle done and the buglers silent, Americans were bone-weary and bloodied, and now the people of America, the North and the South, now faced the staggering challenge of peace. After 4 years of fierce fighting, 2% of the population killed, millions of people displaced, slavery now abolished, and millions more people displaced because of that, 4 questions were on the top of the citizens' minds. First of all, how would the South, who was physically devastated by war and socially revolutionized by emancipation, be rebuilt? How would liberated blacks fare as free citizens? How would the southern states be reintegrated into the Union? And who would direct the process of reconstruction of the country? The southern states themselves, the president, or Congress? So we're going to define the major problems facing the nation in the South after the Civil War and what the different responses were of both whites and African Americans to the end of slavery. We're going to look at President Andrew Johnson and his plans for presidential reconstruction. We're going to look at the differences between presidential and congressional approaches to reconstruction. And we're going to look at the legacy of Reconstruction for Johnson's career and the nation, and look at its successes and failures. Here is the timeline of events. Here. And I want to draw y'all's attention to a couple of really cool photographs pertaining to President Lincoln and his last couple photographs taken of him. This photograph was of President Lincoln right here giving his second inaugural address in March of 1865. And in this photograph, you have his actual assassin. Here is John Wilkes Booth, the guy who's going to end up killing Lincoln a little over a month later, watching Lincoln give his second inaugural address. If you didn't realize, Booth was pretty famous, so he could pretty much go wherever he wanted to. During the Civil War, he could do whatever he wanted. He was a relatively famous actor in and of his own right, but he came from a very famous acting family, and so it wouldn't have been out of place for him to be here seeing the president give an address. And then the second photograph is a president and a future president. Here is Abraham Lincoln's funeral parade when it got to New York City. And so you can see the funeral procession going down the street here. And then this photograph right here, this boy, one of these two boys, but we're pretty sure it's this boy right here, is Theodore Roosevelt when he was about 4 years old. And he is in the window. This was his grandfather's home in New York City. And here is Theodore Roosevelt watching the president's funeral parade. So I just wanted to share those two pictures with you before we get started on these notes. So there's quite a few problems with peace. After being at war for 4 years, a fierce, bloody war where, you know, the Union sought vengeance for Southern aggression, or for Southern, you know, victories on the battlefield. There were answers that needed to be, there were questions that needed to be answered. Like, what was going to be done with all the captured Confederate ringleaders? You know, they are treasonous. What do you do with the president of a foreign country who has been at war with you and is captured? Well, nobody really knew what to do. There was clamoring from Northerners that Jeff Davis should be hung from a sour apple tree. Well, Davis was held in prison for 2 years. No treason trials were ever held against any of the captured Confederate leaders. And as a little bit of a Christmas gift before Andrew Johnson left the presidency, he pardoned all rebel leaders. They were pardoned from whatever civil crimes they had committed by being treasonous to the country, but they still couldn't serve in leadership positions in the government for another 30 years when Congress finally restored their civil liberties back in the 1890s. As far as the rest of the South, it was pretty much war-ravaged. It was a dismal picture in the war-wrecked South when the Battle of Musketry faded. Not only had an age perished, but a civilization had collapsed in both economic and social structure. The moonlight and magnolia imagery of the Old South, which was largely imaginary in most cases, was forever, pardon the pun, gone with the wind. The handsome cities of the South, like Charleston and Richmond, were rubble-strewn and destroyed. Atlanta, a soldier who had returned to Atlanta, Georgia, remarked that hell had laid her egg and right here it hatched. The economic life of the country had creaked to a halt. Banks and businesses were locked. They had nothing to open up for. They were ruined by inflation, that 9,000% runaway inflation at the end of the war. Any factories that were in the South were silent. They weren't working when the war ended. And all the transportation system was broken down as well, especially in the southeast where Sherman's army had marched through the south and totally destroyed the railroad tracks and any infrastructure that had been built there. So the one thing Southerners had going for them would be agriculture, because that's what they had built their entire economy on in the first place. But agriculture itself was hopelessly crippled by the Civil War. The whole slave labor system had collapsed. There was no more workers to work on the plantations once the slaves were freed. There wasn't any seed to plant. You need to plant seeds to be able to harvest crops. And livestock had been driven off of the properties by the Yankee soldiers as they had come through. There were pathetic instances of men hitching themselves to their plows while women and children gripped the handles and tried to steer through the fields to be able to plant a crop to get through the next year. The planter aristocrats who had ruled the South were humbled, and many of them were reduced to a level of proud poverty. They sat in their charred mansions, their gutted mansions. Their entire investments of slavery and machinery were gone, and they sat on almost worthless land. Their $2 billion worth of investment in slaves, their primary form of wealth, had just got up and left. This left a lot of Southerners dangerously defiant. For years and years and years, they would make references to damn Yankees and your government, referring to the government in Washington, not their government. And there is still instances of this in the South today. Whatever the reason, this whole lost cause mentality of the Confederacy, of a just war, still picked at the bandages and picked at the wounds of the Republic for years to come. Here is a picture of Charleston, South Carolina, or a picture from Charleston, South Carolina at the end of the war. When rebel troops were evacuating the city, they blew up their military supplies so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of General Sherman. And when those supplies blew up, they ignited fires all throughout the rest of the city as well. So let's talk about the freedmen, the freed slaves, and what they could expect from all this. There was quite a bit of confusion in the smoldering South as to what exactly the precise meaning was of freedom for blacks, because they weren't citizens, they didn't have any rights or anything. It would be going out into a field and telling a bunch of cows, you're free now. They kind of look at you and go back to chewing the grass. So emancipation took effect unevenly throughout the South, varying degrees of knowledge of what was actually going to happen. And there was a variety of responses to this whole emancipation thing as well. As Union armies marched in and out of various locations, many blacks found themselves emancipated and then re-enslaved, because while the war was still going on, they were only free as long as Union troops were in the region, and then they had to go back to work on the plantation again. One North Carolina slave estimated that he had celebrated freedom about 12 times throughout the war. In some regions, planters stubbornly protested that slavery was legal until the state legislators or the Supreme Court acted, going back to that idea before the Civil War of states having their own determination of things, which they pretty much lost that right when the war was over. For many slaves, the shackles of bondage were not struck off in a single mighty blow. There was long suffering that took to pry off their chains link by link. All masters were eventually forced to recognize their slaves' permanent freedom, and because of this, tens of thousands of emancipated blacks took to the roads for the first time ever, being able to just leave and go someplace and go look for work somewhere else. Emancipation overall strengthened the black family, because newly freed men and women were able to formalize their slave marriages that weren't official before, and they were able to go in search of their broken families and put them back together again, who had been sold into to other owners. In all this, churches formed the bedrock of black community life, and in some cases, whole communities even moved together in search of opportunity. From 1878 to 1880, some 25,000 blacks from Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi all surged into Kansas to get homestead land and try to become farmers for themselves. Churches gave rise to other benevolent and fraternal mutual aid societies. In 1850, there were about 150,000 members of the Black Baptist Church, and they had reached 500,000 members by 1870. And the other churches for blacks in the South also quadrupled in size after emancipation. All of these things work together to aid each other, to protect freedom and to help people get loans and help people buy businesses for themselves in the early days of emancipation. Being free, being emancipated, also meant the ability to get an education. And freedmen wasted no time establishing societies for self-improvement. They purchased land, they built schoolhouses for their kids, they hired teachers for their kids, and with qualified black teachers in short supply, oftentimes those teachers were filled by white missionaries from the North who came down to the South to educate blacks in these little schoolhouses. Here is a scene in the 1870s of freed slaves. Probably every single person in this picture, all those kids were probably, little bitty kids when the war was going on. Here they are, about 5, 6, 7 years old, beginning of school age, all the way up into their teens, it looks like. Freed slaves in the South regarded schooling as the key to improving their children's lives and the fulfillment of a long-sought right that had been denied blacks in slavery. So one of the things that they looked to for the government was help in all of this stuff that they were trying to do. Because by and large, former slaves were unskilled, right? Their only job had been to pick cotton. Their only job had been to chop logs. There was no technical learning going on plantation life. By and large, blacks were unlettered, which meant they hadn't been schooled. And they didn't have any property or money at all when freed. They were just, said, hey, good luck, by the Union Army. And so, other than, being able to cook simple meals, a lot of slaves didn't have any idea what it meant to be free or how to survive as a free person, because their whole lives they had been provided for by a master. It might not have been the best provisions or what they would have provided for themselves, but they had been provided for. They never had to go buy clothes. They never had to go and get food it was always provided. So before the war was over, in March of 1865, Congress created a organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. And this was a primitive welfare agency. It was established to be able to provide food, clothing, and education to freed slaves. It taught an estimated 200,000 blacks how to read. And, many of them use that knowledge to bolster their own church communities, because now they were able to read the Bible for the first time in their lives and to put words to the stories they had had growing up. They distributed, or there was a plan to distribute 40 acres of abandoned or confiscated land from Confederates to black settlers, and that oftentimes didn't happen because the land was given back to the Confederate owners once they claimed loyalty to the United States again. The Freedmen's Bureau was headed by General Oliver Howard, and like I said, they educated some 200,000 blacks how to read, but the other accomplishments were meager in comparison. Very little of that confiscated land actually passed into black hands, and oftentimes what ended up happening is the Freedmen's Bureau in the South ended up being like an unemployment agency, and so it would arrange contracts for freedmen to go work on farms, oftentimes back at the same plantations that they had worked on before, except now their former owner is their employer and can pay them however little he wants because they are free. See, freedom often just begins other forms of slavery, like wage slavery. On top of that, Southerners and the white Southerners resented the Freedmen's Bureau as a meddlesome federal interloper into their lives and affairs, and didn't trust them either. President Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner himself, shared the same white supremacist views that most white Southerners had, and repeatedly tried to kill the Freedmen's Bureau, but it died on its own in 1872. So let's talk about Andrew Johnson, the another accidental president in our history. So Andrew Johnson was one of those poor mountain whites of Tennessee that we talked about in chapter 16 or 17. The ones who couldn't afford slaves. He was a Southerner, and they couldn't afford slaves to begin with. And he always resented the planter aristocrats of the South because of their superiority, of their using their power and position over people like him. He was orphaned early in life. He never attended school, but he apprenticed to a tailor at the age of 10, so he learned how to make clothes. He taught himself how to read and write, and he represented that ideal American self-made man image that we look up to in American history. The book says, this is probably one of my second or third favorite quotes in the whole book. Ambitious to get ahead, he taught himself to read, and later his wife taught him to write and do simple math. Like many other self-made men, he was inclined to overpraise his maker. So he's a bit vainglorious when it came to his own accomplishments. Early on, when he moved into Tennessee, he became active in politics at the age of 17, and he became a champion of poor whites like himself against the planter aristocrats of the southern areas, the slaveholding areas of the South. So he gets elected to Congress, and he's sitting in Congress for the state of Tennessee when Tennessee decides to secede from the United States in 1861. He refuses to secede with his state, and he remains a congressman in Congress without a state, which gains him a lot of interest and support from the North. When Tennessee is occupied by federal troops, he's appointed to be the wartime governor over the state. And in 1864, when Lincoln ran for re-election, and it wasn't quite sure if he could win it on his own because of the fracturing of the peace Democrats versus the war Democrats, the Republican Party goes underground and they become the Liberty Party for one election. And while Lincoln is a Republican, he chooses Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. Johnson's a Democrat, to gain support from other Southern-leaning Democrats in the North to win re-election. Now, obviously, when you choose a vice president, you never intend for that vice president to ever have to be president. But this little thing called fate takes effect from time to time, and on paper, Johnson was the ideal man to fill that role. Now, when it came to Johnson, he was devoted to duty and to the Constitution, but he was also a misfit. Because he's from Tennessee, he did not understand the North. Because he was a poor white from Tennessee, he distrusted Southern planters and was not trusted by the South. As a Democrat, he was never accepted by the Republicans in Congress. He was looked down upon because he had not been elected to office. He was just the vice president. And he was hot-headed, he was contentious, and he was stubborn, which are definitely qualities that you don't need when you're trying to rebuild a country after a cataclysmic, apocalyptic civil war. So, all in all, he was the wrong man, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But there he was. A Reconstruction policy devised by angels might well have failed in his tactless hands. So let's talk about presidential Reconstruction. This was the Reconstruction plan that Lincoln had come up with during the war. He was already planning ahead as early as 1863 that when the war was over, there would need to be an idea, there would need to be a plan for how to rebuild the country. And so Lincoln came up with something called the 10% Reconstruction Plan, where a state would be brought back into the Union when 10% of its voters had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States and pledged to abide by emancipation. Then the next step would be the formal erection of a state government, and where they would put new state constitutions in place. And then Lincoln would recognize the now purified state to come back into the United States. Even in 1863, this provoked a very sharp reaction in Congress because there were already Republicans who were taking a more radical plan towards Reconstruction. Republicans in Congress who had come to enjoy their domination that they had had over Congress for the several years by that point, feared that once Southerners were re-allowed back into the country, the planter aristocrats would come back to power and that blacks would end up re-enslaved. So, to challenge this, in 1864, Republicans pushed through Congress something called the Wade-Davis Bill that will then take that 10% number that Lincoln had called for and require 50%, so half of the state's voters, to take an oath of allegiance. And also demanded stronger safeguards for emancipation before a state would enter into the Union. Lincoln never approved this. Lincoln used a tactic called a pocket veto, where you just leave a bill on your desk and you don't sign it and you don't send it back to Congress, or you don't veto it for Congress to go and vote on it again and pass it without your consent. So Lincoln doesn't sign it, and the bill expires whenever Congress goes into recess. This whole Wade Davis thing revealed the deep differences between Lincoln's ideology of Reconstruction and Congress's ideology of Reconstruction. You had moderates and radicals. The majority of Republicans felt pretty much like Lincoln did, that the seceded southern states should be restored to the United States as soon as possible and as simply and swiftly as reasonable to rebuild the country. But there was a minority radical group that believed that the South could be restored only after their social structure had been totally uprooted, after the planters had been punished, and after blacks had received protection by federal power. So we have no way of knowing how Lincoln's Reconstruction would have gone if he would have had the power to push it through Congress and make it happen, because an assassin's bullet tore a path through the back of his brain in April of 1865. And so President Johnson then had to take Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction and try to implement it. Johnson, who had also hated the planter aristocracy, he would also share their desire to reconstruct the South with an iron rod. But Johnson soon disillusioned the radicals when he recognized several of Lincoln's 10% government plans. In May of 1865, President Johnson issues his Reconstruction Proclamation that would call for special state conventions. Those state conventions had to take a vote and repeal their secession votes that they had made in 1860 and 1861. Also, they had to repudiate all their Confederate debts, and they had to ratify the slave-freeing 13th Amendment to be allowed back into the country. Johnson then granted pardons to the aristocrats who were now begging him for his favor, which he really enjoyed. And as soon as those aristocrats received their pardons, they went back to being the planter elite of the South. And they started putting into place things like the black codes. If you remember the slave codes of South Carolina, these black codes aren't any less racially based than the slave codes. In fact, some of them they just took and replaced the word slave and replaced it with the word black. So these black codes were designed to regulate the affairs of blacks in the South. They were aimed to ensure a stable and subservient labor force. They imposed penalties on blacks who, quote, jumped their labor contracts when they went and took a contract to work for a planter. If they left before that planter's contract was over, they could face jail time or physical punishment, whipping for jumping their labor contract. And those labor contracts would entangle these free blacks into working for the same employer for 1 year's time. basically just like little contracts of slavery. And what the Black Codes really did is they really sought to restore that pre-emancipation system of race relationships in the South, to keep the thousands of impoverished former slaves perpetually slipped down into the bottom rung of the ladder as sharecroppers, down on the ladder. The funny thing about these Black Codes is that, you know, they didn't have any rights whatsoever. The freedmen were legally recognized as free persons, but they couldn't serve on a jury or vote. They were barred from renting or leasing land, and thousands of these blacks slipped down into the bottom of the ladder as sharecropper farmers. And what was worse about all this is that it's not only blacks now trapped in this system of perpetual debt as farmers, but all those poor whites who before the war had one day hoped to own a slave for prosperity, they're now on the same rung of the ladder as these poor blacks, and now anybody can be impoverished and work perpetually for a farmer for low wages, both free blacks and poor whites. And it left the southern farmers, the southern planter aristocracy, with not only the freedom of not having to provide for slaves because now they're free and they're supposed to be able to provide for themselves, they also have a bigger labor force because they can pay a poor white farmer to do the same job as a poor black farmer and have double the workforce. So after those 4 years of harsh fighting, had the North really won the war? Because it sure didn't seem like it. So after seeing what kind of Reconstruction Andrew Johnson was going to do, Congress started stepping in and started instituting their own congressional Reconstruction. In November of 1865, after several of the former Confederate states had held their constitutional conventions and had elected governments, Northern Republicans were shocked when many former Confederate leaders came to Washington to claim their seats in Congress. For 4 years' time, Republicans, without any Southern intervention, had passed legislation that had largely favored the North, like the Morrill Act, the Pacific Railroad Act of being able to build a transcontinental railroad on that northern route through the Kansas Territory, the Homestead Act. So being able to do things like they wanted for a while, the Northern congressmen wanted to lock out the Southerners for longer. A restored South was stronger than ever. Now, because the slaves are free, there is a larger population in the South than there ever was before. Before the war, slaves were still counted as 3/5 of a person because of the old 3/5 compromise back during the Constitutional Convention. But now, free blacks, even though they couldn't vote, were counted as full people when it came to representation. Now the rebel votes, when they came back in, or the rebel states, were entitled to more votes than they had in 1860, back before the whole country fell apart. And with that representation, they could dismantle the whole entire economic program of the Republican Party. Johnson sees no problem with this, and December 6, 1865, he states that the Union has been restored. So now the clash between the President and Congress is inevitable. In March of 1866, Congress passes a civil rights bill that will confer on blacks the privileges of American citizenship, such as voting. And in April, President Johnson vetoes this measure. He puts his signature on it and sends it back to Congress as a veto. In April, the congressmen pass it again and overturn his veto, and they push it into law. And Congress increasingly assumes a dominant role in running the government over the president. Republicans rivet the principles of the Civil Rights Bill into the Constitution when they create the 14th Amendment, which gives civil rights, citizenship, confers civil rights and citizenship on the freedmen. It reduces the representation of a state in Congress and the Electoral College if it denies blacks the right to vote. It doesn't give blacks explicitly the right to vote, but it reduces a state's representation if they do deny blacks the right to vote. It disqualifies federal and state office to former Confederates who had once sworn to support the Constitution of the United States. And it guaranteed the federal debt and repudiated all Confederate debts. Now, you notice here in this amendment, it doesn't give the right to vote to freed blacks. But it does make sure that no state would be welcomed back into the United States without ratifying the amendment first. So it holds it over all the southern states' hands, or over all the southern states' heads, to you have to approve this amendment before you come back into the United States. Johnson advises the southern states to reject it, and all except Tennessee spurned the amendment because Tennessee was quickly admitted back into the United States in 1865 before all this stuff went down. In the congressional elections of 1866, it was a non-national election year, so Johnson wasn't running for re-election or anything. Johnson was eager to secure a majority that was favorable to a soft on the South policy. He spoke in cities in support of his views, campaigning for a soft on the South policy. And in the summer of 1866, Johnson went on a speaking tour that they called the Swing Round the Circle, where he delivered a series of give 'em hell speeches, and many people saw that the dignity of the presidential office sank to a new low because of all this. He accused the radicals in Congress of having planned large-scale anti-black riots and murder in the South, and as he spoke, hecklers hurled insults at him. Reverting to his stump-speaking days in Tennessee, he shouted back angry retorts amid the cries of "You be damned" and "Don't get mad, Andy." So he was having his own personal Twitter war on stage with these people while he was talking. When a majority of ballots were counted, Republicans had a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, and radical Reconstruction, or Republican Reconstruction, begins. The Republicans now had a veto-proof Congress. They had enough of a majority that the president could sign a veto to anything and they could overturn it. And they were led by several radicals, like Charles Sumner, the guy that was caned before the war. He's back, and he's back in the Senate, and Thaddeus Stevens is a representative in the South pushing through radical legislation. The radical Republicans were opposed to a rapid restoration of the southern states, and they wanted to keep the southern states out as long as possible to maintain northern power over the country. They wanted to apply federal power to bring about social and economic transformation in the South. Moderate Republicans invoked the principles of states' rights and self-government, and they preferred policies that restrained the states from abridging citizens' rights rather than getting the federal government directly involved in individual lives. And the moderates were the majority faction in Congress. But by 1867, both radicals and moderates agreed of the necessity to give blacks the right to vote. So, in March of 1867, Congress passed what's called the Reconstruction Act that took the southern states and divided them into 5 military districts where they had a military governor in place. And this was the way that they were supposed to be allowed back into the United States, where they would have this military district in charge of things, and they had to meet certain criteria to be able to come back into the United States. First of all, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. They had to agree to the terms of that. And they had to guarantee in their state constitutions full freedom for all full voting rights for all former male slaves. And in 1869, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which incorporated black suffrage into the Constitution and made it a constitutional issue. Here's a map from page 356 of the military districts that were put in place. Military Reconstruction in the South usurped the president's functions as commander-in-chief and set up a martial regime in the states. It had dubious legality. It had never been done before, obviously. In a court case in 1866, the Supreme Court had ruled that military tribunals could not try civilians when civil courts were open. And so, because civil courts were in place, the constitutionality of having military governments in place was kind of shaky at best. But by 1870, all southern states had reorganized their governments and accorded full rights back into the United States. So these 3 Reconstruction era amendments had some disappointments to them, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The amendments disappointed people who were advocates of women's rights. Women who had been at the forefront before the war of the abolitionist movement felt really betrayed by giving blacks the right to vote before them. They felt like they should have been a part of the 15th Amendment, and that they should have all been given the right to vote, women and free blacks. The 14th Amendment for the first time inserted the word male into the Constitution in reference to a citizen's right to vote. And before this point, all the amendments had been, or all the Constitution had been non-gendered. Obviously, male was going to be the dominant up in that point because of society and the way it was structured, but it didn't need to be written. And the 14th Amendment, for some reason, for the first time ever, male had to be written. It would take another 50 years before Congress passes an amendment to get women the right to vote. So let's talk about Reconstruction in the South and the sad realities of it. Black men, with their right to suffrage, often had it taken away from them. Southern black men seized the initiative and they began to organize politically. They were bolstered by a group called the Union League. Freedmen turned the network into a network of political clubs, and educated members campaigned for Republican candidates. There were quite a few black Republicans who served in state legislators and reconstructed state assemblies in the South during these first couple years of Reconstruction. Here's a picture from page 358 in your book of black men, freedmen, voting in Richmond, Virginia in 1871. The Union League's mission soon expanded into building black churches and schools, setting that bedrock of community for the black church, of representing black grievances in court, and recruiting militias to protect black communities from white violence. African American women even assumed new political roles by attending parades and rallies and helping to assemble mass meetings, and showed up for constitutional conventions as well. Black men were elected as delegates to state constitutional conventions, and they were delegates who were the backbone of the black political community. Offended one-time masters lashed out at the freedmen's white allies, and there are two words here that are vocabulary words that are scalawags and carpetbaggers. The scalawags were Southerners who were accused of plundering the treasuries of the Southern governments, that they had been in charge during the war and they had profited from being in those positions of authority. And carpetbaggers were former soldiers and Northern businessmen who wanted to play a role in modernizing the New South, and they were called carpetbaggers because that was like the suitcase back then, a bag of, a cloth bag, and they'd come down to the South on a train and horseback and be carrying all of their possessions with them in a carpet bag. So black voters comprised a majority of the electorate in 5 states. Black political participation expanded exponentially during Reconstruction, and there were more than a dozen black congressmen and 2 black senators who served in Congress. I think this is pretty important. Oftentimes when we get to Black History Month, they always make reference to the first black, they'll say that, so-and-so was the first black congressman, so-and-so was the first black senator, and they often forget these black congressmen who served during Reconstruction because they were Republican. They don't have that little D behind their name, and so they're not written in the history books, or they're not talked about in popular history that you see on TV or in magazines. The radical legislators passed a much more desirable legislation in the states. They established public schools. They streamlined the tax systems. They launched public works programs and guaranteed property rights to women. And because of all this success and ability of black legislators, there were many whites who resented it. And a certain secret organization mushroomed in the South that grew up in 1866 of these secret hooded men. Oftentimes they were returned home Confederate soldiers. They put on hoods and they went through the countryside and hammered on black cabin doors to frighten them. And the members flogged, mutilated, or even murdered blacks in the middle of the night, inflicting fear to anybody who was an upstart or trying to reconstruct the South. Here's the picture from page 359 in the book. There was this one incident in one Louisiana parish in 1868. Whites in 2 days killed or wounded 200 victims. A pile of 25 bodies was found half buried in the woods. By such atrocious terror tactics, these blacks, quote, kept in their place. And that is down on the bottom of the ladder. Congress was outraged by this lawlessness, and they passed the harsh Force Acts in 1870 and 1871. But the invisible empire of the Ku Klux Klan had already done its work of intimidation, and had already laid the backbone for this white resistance. There were other organizations that were founded in the South. They called themselves missionary clubs or rifle clubs or dancing societies or white man's unions, and Sons of Pythias, which is one that was popular here in Wharton. And of course we had the white man's union here in Wharton all the way until the 1960s. But they were organizations that attempted to undermine the black empowerment. They openly flouted the 14th and 15th Amendments of disenfranchising black citizenship and black voting rights. And they eventually achieved a wholesale disenfranchisement of blacks by intimidation, fraud, and trickery. I want to draw your attention to a quote in the book on page 360 that was Frederick Douglass's impression of slavery and its abolishment in the country. It said that though slavery was abolished, the wrongs of my people were not ended. Though they were not slaves, they were not yet quite free. No man can be truly free whose liberty is dependent upon the thought, feeling, and action of others, and who has himself no means in his own hands regarding protecting, defending, and maintaining that liberty. Yet the Negro, after his emancipation, was precisely in this state of destitution. He was free from the individual master, but the slave of society. He had neither money, property, nor friends. He was free from the old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. He was free from the old quarter that once gave him shelter, but a slave to the rains of summer and the frosts of winter. He was, in a word, literally turned loose, naked, hungry, and destitute, to the open sky. So we're going to wrap up this chapter here with the impeachment of President Johnson when the whole radical Republicans rise up against him. Radicals sharpened their hatchets, and they attempted to remove Johnson by constitutional processes. Now, the Republicans have a majority in Congress, so anything they do, he can't veto. So in 1867, they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act that requires the president to secure the Senate, or to secure the consent of the Senate before he could remove cabinet members. This gives Congress authority over the president's cabinet decisions, and if he wants to remove somebody, they have to approve it. And it just so happens that in the in the president's cabinet is a man named Edwin Stanton, who was outwardly loyal to Johnson, but he was a spy and an informer for the radicals about what happened inside of Johnson's cabinet meetings. In 1868, even though the Tenure of Office Act was in place, Johnson abruptly dismisses Stanton, and now Congress has the ammunition they can use to impeach Andrew Johnson under the high crimes and misdemeanors portion of the Constitution. They charged him with violations of the Tenure of Office Act and also additional articles like disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach. Hey, you know what? You've all lived through Trump's impeachment. I lived through 2 impeachments so far. This doesn't sound anything different to me when you have one faction who has a majority in Congress trying to disgrace the president and get him kicked out. Y'all know the routine by now. The Senate, as it says in the Constitution, sat as a court to try Johnson. His attorneys argued that the president fired Stanton to put the case before the Supreme Court, and the House prosecutors had a harder time building a compelling case for impeachment. And when it all came down to it, by a margin of only 1 vote, the radicals failed to get the 2/3 majority for Johnson's removal. So here the nation avoids a precedent that would have gravely weakened one of the 3 branches of the federal government of being able to remove a president. Even though it's in the Constitution, it needs to rarely be done. This whole Trump impeachment thing of the 2019-2020 era is something that was a media circus, and it was done for all the wrong reasons. Whatever your politics are, the president's position cannot be so lightly taken away by Congress. Let's talk about one other thing that's going to have impact in the future of the United States, and that's the purchase of Alaska. In 1867, the Russians decided they weren't going to go forward with any eastern expansion into North America, and they decided they wanted to sell off their big, vast territory known as Alaska. The region had been furred out, it had been trapped out, and there were hardly any animals of economic viability there. And so having the land was an economic liability to the Russians. And so Secretary of State William Seward signed a treaty that transferred Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, which caught a lot of scorn here in the United States, calling it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. However, there were several reasons why Congress and the United States sanctioned the purchase. For one thing, Russia had been one of the only great powers to be openly friendly to the North during the Civil War, and Americans did not feel that they could afford their good friend the Tsar. They didn't feel like offending him by rejecting the offer. It was also rumored that there were still valuables to be found in Alaska. That gold was up there, and there would be a gold rush in the 1890s to Alaska when it was found. But even more importantly, for the future of the United States, it turned out that there was massive amounts of oil and gas under Alaska and in Alaska's waters that would benefit the United States in the 20th century. So the last thing today is the heritage of Reconstruction. For white Southerners, Reconstruction was more of a grievous wound than the war itself. It resented the upending of social and racial systems, the political empowerment of blacks, and saw federal intervention into their local affairs. Given the issues that caused the war and the bitterness of the fighting, it's a wonder that Reconstruction was not far harsher than it was. Northern policymakers groped for the right policies and trying to put in place. Republicans acted from a mixture of idealism and political expediency. Republicans wanted to protect the freed slaves, and they sought to promote the fortunes of the Republican Party. But in the end, both of their efforts backfired badly. They could either do one really well, but they couldn't do both well at all. And in the end, Reconstruction conferred only fleeting benefits on blacks that were forgotten about as soon as the military left the South. And it extinguished the Republican Party in the South for nearly 100 years, because after Reconstruction, after the southern states were back in power, blacks were overwhelmingly Republican, but they couldn't vote. And so it was a Democratic majority in the South for 100 years. Moderate Republicans never fully appreciated the extensive effort necessary to make the freed slaves completely independent citizens. Southern whites would go great lengths to preserve their system of racial dominance, which we saw through the black codes all the way up to the Ku Klux Klan. And the Old South was in many ways more resurrected than reconstructed. It wasn't just a resurrection, it was an idealism of what life was like before the Civil War, before the North came and ruined everything, and the South lived with that idea of the white pillared mansions and the Miss Scarlets from Gone with the Wind as an image, rather than the truth of what the South really was before the war. Well, that does it. That's chapter 22. That's the end of 1301. I really hope that these videos have been helpful for you while we've been in quarantine and lockdown. I know that there's about 4 or 5 of you who have been watching these videos, and I hope that they've been educational for you. They've certainly given me a lot of experience in mediocre editing and film work, and so I hope to be able to update my equipment and be able to do better presentations and better videos, maybe in 30-minute chunks for next school year. So this has been a learning experience for me, and I appreciate it. I have some things that I'm thinking about doing concerning your research papers that you did. I'm still grading the test that was this last weekend. I just got done with all the junior college students, and I'll be working on the Google Classroom students today. But I want to say that I've been honored to be your professor for this year, and I hope to see you all out in the community before all this is over. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.